Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A strange three-digit number. When I first arrived in the United States, I thought my biggest challenge would be English. I practiced every morning. I listened to slow English while making breakfast. I repeated simple sentences during my walk. I spoke to myself while driving. Sometimes I made mistakes that sounded funny, but I believed every small step was taking me closer to a better life. I thought language was the biggest mountain in front of me. I was wrong. One afternoon, I discovered another mountain. It was much smaller than I expected, but somehow much taller than any language barrier. It was called a credit score. The first time I heard those words, I smiled politely because I did not want anyone to know that I had absolutely no idea what they meant. The bank employee looked at me kindly and asked, "Do you know your credit score?" I nodded for a second, hoping the conversation would move on. Inside my head, however, I was asking myself a completely different question. What is a credit score? Why does everyone in America seem to understand it except me? That evening, I searched for the answer online. The explanation sounded simple. A credit score is a number that helps lenders decide how risky it might be to lend you money. Most scores fall between 300 and 850. The higher the number, the more trustworthy you appear financially. It sounded easy enough. Then I realized something surprising. I did not have a low score. I did not have a high score. I had no score at all. Imagine arriving in a country where you have years of work experience, good habits, honest intentions, and big dreams. Yet a computer quietly tells you that none of those things can be measured because there is no financial history attached to your name. That moment felt strange. It almost felt like pressing the reset button on my life. If you are learning English with me today, let me teach you a useful phrase. I don't have a credit history. Please repeat slowly. I don't have a credit history. It is a simple sentence, but for many newcomers in America, those 6 words carry a great deal of emotion. At first, I felt embarrassed. I wondered if I had already made a mistake without realizing it. Then I learned something important. Millions of people start exactly where I started. Students, immigrants, young adults. Even some people who have lived in America for years may have very limited credit history. Suddenly, I was not alone anymore. Psychologists often talk about something called uncertainty stress. The human brain prefers problems that have clear answers. When we cannot understand the rules, our anxiety grows quickly. Researchers have found that uncertainty often creates more stress than bad news itself. That idea explained exactly how I felt during those first weeks. It was not only about money. It was about not understanding the system. The interesting part is that learning English felt surprisingly similar. The first time I heard native speakers talking at normal speed, every sentence sounded like one long word. I could recognize individual vocabulary when reading, but listening was completely different. Sometimes I wanted to quit. Sometimes I thought maybe my brain simply was not made for another language. Then something funny happened. One morning, while listening to slow English during breakfast, I suddenly understood an entire sentence without translating it into my first language. It lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds gave me hope. My brain was changing little by little. Building credit works almost the same way. Nobody wakes up with an excellent credit score. Nobody becomes fluent in English overnight. Both journeys reward consistency much more than perfection. That realization changed my attitude. Instead of worrying about what I did not have, I started asking better questions. What can I learn today? What small action can I take today? Which mistake can become tomorrow's lesson? Those questions became my daily routine. Every morning I practiced slow English for 30 minutes. Every afternoon I learned something new about American life. Sometimes it was about banking. Sometimes it was about renting an apartment. Sometimes it was about health insurance. Everything felt confusing at first, but every answer removed one more layer of fear. One thing I noticed quickly was how different financial culture could be in America. Back home, many people believed avoiding debt completely was always the safest choice. In the United States, responsible borrowing could actually help build trust with banks. That idea surprised me. It sounded backwards until I understood the system more clearly. I remember walking through a grocery store one evening after work. Families were laughing together. Children were asking for ice cream. Couples were discussing dinner plans. Everything looked so ordinary. Yet I realized every family had their own invisible story. Some were paying off student loans. Some were saving for their first home. Some were rebuilding after difficult times. Every smiling face carried challenges that nobody else could see. That thought comforted me. Maybe I was not behind. Maybe I was simply at the beginning. And beginnings always look small. There is another English sentence I want you to practice with me because it became one of my favorite reminders. Every expert was once a beginner. Slowly again. Every expert was once a beginner. Simple words. Powerful meaning. The more I repeated that sentence, the less afraid I became of making mistakes. My pronunciation improved little by little. My confidence grew quietly. I started speaking to cashiers instead of avoiding conversations. I smiled more. I asked questions instead of pretending I already knew the answers. Looking back now, I realized that the 3-digit number was never the real lesson. The real lesson was learning that life in America rewards patience. Small habits repeated every day often create extraordinary results years later. Whether you are building your English, building your confidence, or building your credit history, today's tiny step may become tomorrow's biggest opportunity. What I did not know was that only a few days later, one unexpected conversation would completely change both my understanding of credit scores and the direction of my personal life forever. I had no idea that a simple visit to a neighborhood coffee shop would become the beginning of one of the most important chapters of my life. At that time, I was still trying to understand American culture one small piece at a time. Every day felt like solving a new puzzle. Why did strangers smile at me so often? Why did cashiers ask, "How's your day going?" even though we had never met? Why did people say, "Let's get coffee sometime," but not always mean tomorrow? Little by little, I realized that learning English was not only about vocabulary. It was also about understanding people, habits, emotions, and the invisible rules that made everyday conversations feel natural. One rainy Saturday morning, I carried my notebook into a quiet coffee shop because I wanted to practice reading English aloud. I ordered a small black coffee, found a seat near the window, and opened a short article about personal finance. Ironically, the article was explaining credit scores again. I laughed quietly to myself because it seemed impossible to escape this mysterious 3-digit number. I whispered each sentence slowly, trying to improve my pronunciation. Credit history, payment history, financial responsibility. The words still felt unfamiliar, but they no longer frightened me. Then someone sitting at the next table smiled and asked, "Are you studying English?" For a second, I almost answered with my usual short reply, but something inside me said, "This is your chance." I smiled back and said, "Yes." I practice every day. The conversation lasted only 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes taught me more practical English than several hours of studying alone. The stranger spoke slowly after noticing that English was not my first language. We talked about weather, work, food, and finally about the article lying open on my table. Credit scores confuse almost everyone at first, the stranger said with a laugh. Even many Americans don't fully understand them. I was surprised. Until then, I believed I was the only person confused by the system. Hearing those words immediately reduced my anxiety. Sometimes the greatest gift another person can give you is not an answer. It is the reminder that you are not alone. Scientists who study learning often explain something called the growth mindset. When people believe abilities can improve through practice, they stay motivated longer and recover more quickly after mistakes. I did not know the scientific term back then, but I could feel the idea working inside me. Every new conversation became less scary. Every pronunciation mistake became less embarrassing. Every confusing financial lesson became another page in my notebook instead of another reason to give up. From that day on, I created a simple routine. Every morning I listened to slow English while preparing breakfast. Every afternoon I learned one new English phrase connected to daily life. Every evening I reviewed one financial topic in simple English instead of translating everything into my native language. My notebook slowly filled with useful expressions. Could you explain that again? I'm still learning English. Can you speak a little more slowly? Thank you for your patience. Those sentences became my small bridge into American life. Looking back, I think one reason many people stop learning English is because they expect confidence to come first. They believe they must feel ready before speaking. My experience taught me the opposite. Confidence usually arrives after action, not before it. The first conversation feels uncomfortable. The 10th feels easier. The 100th feels natural. The same principle applies to building credit. You do not wait until you have a perfect score before acting responsibly. Responsible actions are exactly what create the score over time. That idea fascinated me. America seemed to reward consistency more than perfection. One payment made on time might not change everything overnight, just as one English lesson would not make me fluent. But hundreds of small actions, repeated patiently, could completely transform a person's future. Suddenly, the entire system made sense. I began noticing examples everywhere. The elderly couple walking together every evening probably had thousands of ordinary days behind their beautiful relationship. The successful business owner serving customers with a smile probably started with uncertainty too. The confident coworker who spoke effortlessly during meetings had likely practiced for years before sounding so natural. Nothing meaningful seemed to happen overnight. Everything valuable appeared to grow quietly, almost invisibly, before anyone noticed the results. That realization gave me peace. I no longer compared my beginning to someone else's middle. Instead, I compared today's version of myself to yesterday's. Could I understand one more English sentence today? Could I learn one more fact about life in America today? Could I become just 1% better? Those tiny improvements became surprisingly exciting. Every completed lesson felt like placing another brick in the foundation of a future I could not yet see. Then one evening, while checking my mailbox after work, I found a plain white envelope. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. Yet inside that envelope was an opportunity that would begin changing my financial life forever. I did not realize it then. But this small piece of mail would become my very first step toward building a real credit history in the United States, and it would also lead me to meet someone who would later change my heart in ways I never expected. My first credit lesson. I'm going to share something that embarrassed me more than any English mistake I had ever made. It did not happen because I mispronounced a word. It did not happen because I misunderstood a conversation. It happened because I believed that working hard was enough. Then one short meeting showed me that in America, effort is important, but understanding the system can be just as important. If you have ever wondered why a simple 3-digit number can open doors for some people and quietly close them for others, stay with me. By the end of the story, you may discover that the biggest obstacle is often not what you don't have. It is what nobody has ever explained to you. A few days after receiving that mysterious envelope in my mailbox, I walked into a local bank with more confidence than experience. The building looked modern and welcoming. Bright windows filled the lobby with sunlight, and everyone greeted customers with friendly smiles. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that this was another opportunity to practice English. Every real conversation, even a difficult one, was helping me become a better speaker. When my name was called, I followed a financial advisor into a small office. She smiled warmly and asked about my plans. Did I want to save money? Was I interested in building credit? Did I hope to buy a car one day? Maybe even a home? I answered slowly, choosing each English word carefully. Yes, I said. I want to build a good future here. She nodded and opened her computer. For a few seconds, she typed quietly. Then her expression became thoughtful. I don't see any credit history yet, she said gently. Those 7 words felt much heavier than I expected. I knew they were not criticism. She was simply stating a fact. But in that moment, I felt as though my entire life before arriving in America had disappeared from the screen. Years of working hard, paying bills, saving money, and acting responsibly were invisible because none of them existed inside the American credit system. I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind for days. Is that bad? She smiled again. No, she replied. It just means you're starting from the beginning. That sentence changed everything. Starting from the beginning sounded very different from failing. Beginners have room to grow. Beginners can learn. Beginners improve every day. Suddenly, I remembered my first English class. On the first day, I could barely introduce myself. I paused after almost every word. I translated every sentence inside my head before speaking. I was afraid that people would laugh at my pronunciation. Yet month after month, those tiny improvements slowly became visible. Maybe credit worked the same way. The advisor explained that credit scores are built through consistent financial behavior. Paying bills on time, keeping balances low, and using credit responsibly all contribute to building trust over time. There is no magic shortcut. There is no secret button. There are only small habits repeated consistently. I smiled because the idea sounded surprisingly familiar. That was exactly how language learning worked. Linguists often explain that the brain strengthens new language patterns through repetition rather than intensity. Studying for 10 minutes every day usually produces better long-term results than studying for 5 hours once a month. Financial experts describe credit in a similar way. One responsible decision rarely changes everything overnight, but hundreds of responsible decisions gradually build a strong financial reputation. Science and daily life were telling the same story. Small actions matter. Before leaving the office, the advisor recommended applying for a secured credit card. She explained that it was designed for people with little or no credit history. I had never heard of such a card before. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I became curious. Curiosity is a powerful emotion because it pushes fear into the background. The more questions I asked, the more comfortable I felt. I realized that many newcomers avoid asking questions because they worry about looking inexperienced. Ironically, asking questions is exactly what helps people become experienced. On my way home, I replayed the entire conversation in my mind. I practiced the new English vocabulary aloud while driving. Credit limit. Payment due date. Credit history. Financial responsibility. Speaking the words repeatedly helped both my pronunciation and my confidence. Researchers have found that reading aloud activates multiple learning systems in the brain at the same time. You see the words, hear the sounds, and produce the language yourself. That combination strengthens memory far more effectively than silent reading alone. Without realizing it, I was improving my English while learning about personal finance. That evening, I shared the experience with a coworker. I expected sympathy. Instead, he laughed kindly and admitted that he had made several credit mistakes when he was younger because nobody had explained the rules clearly. His honesty surprised me. I had imagined that everyone born in America automatically understood credit scores. The truth was much more comforting. Many people learn through trial and error. Many people make mistakes before they succeed. The difference is that successful people usually treat mistakes as teachers instead of permanent labels. That lesson stayed with me. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to everyday American life. I noticed how often people discuss budgeting, saving, mortgages, student loans, and retirement planning. Financial conversations were part of ordinary life, just like talking about weather or sports. Understanding those conversations also improved my listening skills because they introduced practical vocabulary used in real situations rather than textbooks. Every cashier, every banker, every customer service representative became another English teacher without even knowing it. My ears slowly adapted to different accents, speaking speeds, and expressions. Sometimes I still misunderstood people. Sometimes I needed them to repeat themselves. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I simply smiled and said, "Could you say that one more time, please?" Almost everyone responded with patience. Looking back now, I realize that confidence grows quietly. You rarely notice it from one day to the next. Then one morning, you suddenly find yourself having an entire conversation in English without translating every sentence first. Progress often arrives silently before announcing itself. I believed my biggest lesson had already happened inside that small bank office. I was wrong. Only a few weeks later, an unexpected meeting with someone special would connect my journey of learning English, building credit, and discovering love in a way I never could have imagined. Meeting someone special. I'm about to tell you about the conversation that changed far more than my English. I thought I was simply learning how to survive in America, one new word at a time. I believed I was only trying to build a credit score, understand a different culture, and create a stable future. I had no idea that one unexpected meeting would quietly connect all of those pieces together. Sometimes life doesn't announce its biggest turning points with fireworks. Sometimes they begin with a simple smile, an ordinary question, and a person who walks into your life when you least expect it. If you have ever wondered whether small conversations can truly change your future, this part of my story may surprise you. A few weeks after my visit to the bank, I decided to spend more time speaking English outside of work. Reading books and watching slow English videos had helped me understand grammar and vocabulary. But I knew that real conversations were completely different. In real life, people interrupted each other, laughed in the middle of sentences, changed topics without warning, and used expressions that never appeared in language textbooks. At first, those conversations felt like trying to catch raindrops with my hands. I could understand a few words, lose the next sentence entirely, and then suddenly understand everything again. Instead of becoming discouraged, I reminded myself that every native speaker had also learned language one conversation at a time. One Saturday morning, my local library hosted a free community conversation club where people from different countries gathered to practice English. The room was filled with friendly faces. Some people came from Brazil. Others were from Japan, Mexico, India, South Korea, Germany, and many other places. Everyone carried the same mixture of excitement and nervousness. We all wanted to improve, but none of us wanted to make mistakes in front of strangers. The volunteer leading the group smiled and said something I still remember today. This room is not a place to speak perfect English. It's a place to speak brave English. Those words immediately changed the atmosphere. Suddenly nobody cared about perfect grammar anymore. We simply started talking. During one conversation exercise, I found myself sitting across from someone whose warm smile immediately made me feel comfortable. She introduced herself slowly after noticing that I was still learning.
Emily.
Nice to meet you. Her voice was calm, patient, and encouraging. I answered carefully, trying not to rush my pronunciation. I'm happy to meet you too. The conversation began with simple questions. Where are you from? What brought you to America? What do you enjoy doing on weekends? The questions were ordinary, but the conversation felt different. Emily listened carefully instead of waiting for her turn to speak. Whenever I searched for a word, she gave me enough time to find it instead of finishing my sentence. That simple act of patience gave me confidence I had not felt before. Educational psychologists often explain that people learn better when they feel psychologically safe. When learners know they will not be judged for mistakes, the brain becomes more willing to experiment, remember, and improve. Looking back, I believe that conversation became one of the safest learning environments I had experienced since arriving in America. We laughed about funny misunderstandings caused by English. I told her how I once answered "you too" after a waiter said, "Enjoy your meal," and only realized my mistake after leaving the restaurant. She laughed kindly and admitted that even native speakers sometimes said awkward things without thinking. Hearing that made me realize something important. Communication is not about being perfect. It is about connecting with another human being. I mentioned my recent experience at the bank and confessed that I still found the American credit system confusing. Instead of looking surprised, Emily nodded knowingly. Honestly, she said, most people aren't taught much about credit in school. Many of us learn after making mistakes. That sentence completely changed my perspective. Once again, I discovered that my confusion was not unique. Emily explained how her parents had taught her to pay every bill on time, avoid unnecessary debt, and never spend more than she could comfortably repay. Your credit score isn't your identity, she said softly. It's just a record of financial habits. Those words stayed with me for weeks. They sounded simple, yet incredibly powerful. Around the same time, I had been reading research about habits by behavioral scientists who found that small, repeated actions often shape our future more than occasional moments of motivation. The idea applied to almost everything in life. One healthy meal does not transform your health, but thousands of healthy meals do. One English lesson does not create fluency, but daily practice does. One responsible payment does not create excellent credit, but years of consistency certainly can. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Before leaving the library, Emily smiled and asked if I wanted to meet again the following weekend to practice English over coffee. For a brief moment, I worried that I might misunderstand her invitation. Americans often say, "We should get coffee sometime," without making actual plans. This time was different. She opened her calendar, suggested a specific day and time, and wrote it down. It was real. I spent the entire week looking forward to that meeting. Not because I thought it was the beginning of a love story, but because it felt wonderful to have someone who genuinely enjoyed helping me learn. When Saturday finally arrived, we met at a quiet cafe near a small park. Instead of correcting every grammar mistake, Emily simply kept the conversation flowing naturally. Whenever I used the wrong tense or forgot a word, she repeated my sentence correctly without making me feel embarrassed. Language experts call this technique recasting. And studies suggest that learners often improve naturally when they hear the correct version during meaningful conversations. Without realizing it, she was helping my English become more natural every single week. Our conversations slowly expanded beyond language practice. We talked about childhood memories, family traditions, favorite foods, cultural differences, dreams for the future, and the small surprises that make life in America unique. Autumn arrived, painting the trees with brilliant shades of orange, red, and gold. We walked through parks covered in colorful leaves while discussing everything from Thanksgiving traditions to why Americans seemed so passionate about football. Every meeting taught me new vocabulary, new cultural insights, and something new about myself. Somewhere between those ordinary conversations, something quietly began to change. I found myself smiling more often. My English improved faster than ever before because I was no longer practicing for a test. I was practicing to understand someone who had become genuinely important to me. What I did not realize then was that this friendship was slowly becoming something much deeper, and together we were about to face challenges that would test not only my English and my financial knowledge, but also our hearts. Small habits, big changes. I'm about to tell you about the season when I learned that love does not grow through grand romantic moments alone. Sometimes it grows while comparing grocery prices, learning how to pay bills on time, making grammar mistakes that make both of you laugh, and discovering that success in America is often built through hundreds of tiny decisions that nobody else notices. I once believed that improving my English and building a better credit score were two completely different journeys. I couldn't have been more wrong. As my relationship with Emily became stronger, both of us discovered a surprising truth. The habits that create financial freedom are often the same habits that create stronger communication, healthier relationships, and greater confidence. Looking back now, I realize this chapter quietly shaped the rest of my life in ways I never expected. After Emily and I admitted that we enjoyed much more than practicing English together, life did not suddenly become perfect. There were no movie scenes where everything magically fell into place. Instead, our relationship entered a much more interesting stage. We began sharing ordinary days, and ordinary days have a remarkable way of revealing who people really are. We started cooking dinner together several evenings each week. At first, even simple recipes became language lessons. Emily would hand me vegetables and say, "Could you chop these into small pieces?" The first time she said chop, I looked around the kitchen, completely confused. She laughed gently before showing me exactly what she meant. Soon our kitchen became another classroom. I learned words like whisk, stir, simmer, boil, bake, measure, leftovers, and recipe. Research in language acquisition suggests that vocabulary learned during meaningful real-life experiences is remembered much longer than vocabulary memorized from lists. Without realizing it, I was building my English naturally while building a relationship. At the same time, another quiet transformation was taking place. Every month I received my credit card statement, and every month I paid the full balance before the due date. At first, it felt like a small task that hardly mattered. Emily reminded me that consistency is rarely exciting in the beginning, but it often produces extraordinary results over time. Financial experts frequently compare credit building to planting a tree. You water it regularly, even though nothing dramatic seems to happen for months. Then one day you realize the tree has become strong enough to provide shade for years. That image stayed with me because it perfectly described both my finances and my English. Neither seemed to improve dramatically from one day to the next, yet both looked completely different after several months. One Saturday afternoon, Emily suggested that we create a simple monthly budget together. I smiled nervously because budgeting sounded much more complicated than learning grammar. She opened her laptop and created 4 simple categories: needs, savings, future goals, and fun. Money should help you build a life, she said. It shouldn't become your biggest source of stress. Behavioral scientists have found that people experience less financial anxiety when they make spending decisions intentionally rather than emotionally. Even a simple written budget reduces uncertainty because the brain no longer has to guess where the money is going. We started reviewing every expense together.
Coffee,
Groceries,
gasoline, rent,
utilities, internet, phone bill. At first, I worried that budgeting would make life feel restrictive. Surprisingly, the opposite happened. Because we planned ahead, we actually enjoyed spending money more. We no longer felt guilty buying tickets for a local concert or taking a short weekend trip because those expenses were already part of our plan. The same principles slowly influenced my English learning. Instead of studying only when I felt motivated, I created a predictable routine. Every morning began with 15 minutes of slow English listening while preparing breakfast. During lunch, I read one short article aloud. In the evening, Emily and I spent 20 minutes talking only in English about our day. Some conversations were funny because I accidentally invented new words that did not exist. One evening, I proudly described a neighborhood as very treeful. Emily laughed so hard, she almost dropped her tea. The word you're looking for is leafy, she said, still smiling. We laughed together for several minutes, and I never forgot that vocabulary again. Educational psychologists explain that emotions strengthen memory. Funny experiences, surprising moments, and emotional conversations create stronger neural connections than boring repetition. Every mistake that made us laugh quietly became another permanent English lesson. As autumn slowly turned into winter, I noticed another change inside myself. I no longer introduced myself as someone trying to improve English. I simply spoke. I no longer described myself as someone with no credit history. I was building one. Identity was changing because habits had changed first. James Clear and other researchers who study habit formation often describe this process as identity-based growth. Instead of chasing outcomes alone, people become the type of person who naturally produces those outcomes. I was no longer pretending to be responsible. I was becoming responsible. I was no longer pretending to be an English speaker. I was becoming one conversation at a time. Emily noticed the change before I did. One evening while we were walking through a neighborhood decorated with holiday lights, she smiled and said, "Do you know something?" I looked at her curiously. When we first met, you apologized before almost every English sentence. I laughed because she was absolutely right. Now, she continued, you don't apologize anymore. You simply keep talking. Her observation surprised me because I had not realized how much my confidence had grown. Confidence rarely announces its arrival. Around the same time, I received an email from my bank inviting me to check my updated credit information. My heart raced as I logged into my account. There it was. For the first time in my life, I had a real credit score. It was not extraordinary. It was not perfect, but it was real. I stared at that 3-digit number for several minutes. Months earlier, the absence of a score had made me feel invisible. Now that number represented something entirely different. It represented patience, discipline, and hundreds of small choices that nobody else had seen. Emily smiled when I showed her the screen. That sentence meant more to me than the number itself, because she understood the journey behind it. Science consistently shows that intrinsic motivation lasts much longer than external rewards. My goal is no longer simply achieving a higher credit score or speaking better English. My real goal had become building a life filled with steady progress, meaningful relationships, and quiet confidence. Looking back now, I realize those ordinary months became the strongest foundation of everything that followed. Neither of us knew that life was about to test that foundation much sooner than expected. A financial setback, unexpected family pressures, and difficult decisions were waiting just around the corner, and for the first time, Emily, and I would discover whether our small daily habits were truly strong enough to carry us through life's biggest challenges. Love through challenges. I'm about to share the chapter of my story that almost convinced me love alone was not enough. Until then, Emily and I believed that if we communicated honestly, practiced patience, and kept improving one small step at a time, everything would work out. Life had other plans. The challenges that arrived were not dramatic enough to make the evening news. Yet they were powerful enough to test our relationship every single day. Money became tighter. Time became shorter. Small misunderstandings grew into long conversations. And for the first time since arriving in America, I wondered whether I truly belonged here. If you have ever felt that life becomes most difficult just when everything finally seems to be improving, this part of my journey may feel surprisingly familiar. The first year of our relationship taught us how easy it is to fall in love during peaceful moments. The second year taught us something much more valuable. It showed us whether we could continue choosing each other when life stopped feeling easy. Looking back now, I believe every strong relationship eventually reaches a season where love is measured less by beautiful words and more by quiet actions repeated. Every day, that season arrived for Emily and me sooner than we expected. It began with a simple phone call from my manager asking if I could come into the office before my normal shift. I assumed it was another routine meeting. Instead, I learned that the company was reducing work hours because business had slowed. My position was safe, but my weekly schedule would be reduced significantly. As I drove home that afternoon, my mind raced through dozens of questions. Would I still be able to pay every bill on time? Would my carefully built credit history be affected? Would I need to find a second job? Most of all, I worried about becoming a burden to Emily. Financial stress affects millions of couples, and psychologists have consistently found that uncertainty about money increases anxiety, reduces sleep quality, and makes even ordinary conversations feel more emotionally intense. I experienced every one of those reactions. That evening, I sat quietly at the kitchen table staring at my notebook while Emily prepared dinner. She noticed immediately that something was wrong. Instead of asking 100 questions, she simply sat beside me and waited. After several minutes of silence, I explained everything. I expected disappointment. Instead, she reached for my hand and smiled gently. "We'll solve one problem at a time," she said. Her response reminded me of something I had learned while studying English. Fluency is not built by learning every word in one day. It grows through thousands of manageable lessons. Maybe difficult seasons worked the same way. We did not need to solve our entire future that evening. We only needed to solve tomorrow. The next morning, we sat together with 2 cups of coffee and opened our monthly budget. We looked carefully at every expense. We canceled a few subscriptions we barely used. We planned meals more carefully to reduce food waste. We postponed buying things that were convenient but not necessary. Surprisingly, those decisions never made us feel deprived. Instead, they gave us a sense of control. Behavioral economists often explain that people experience less stress when they focus on decisions they can influence instead of circumstances they cannot. Every small adjustment reminded us that we still had choices. During those weeks, my English continued improving in unexpected ways. Since I had fewer working hours, I volunteered twice a week at a local community center that welcomed newcomers to America. I originally joined to practice speaking English, but I discovered something much more meaningful. I met people who were facing challenges far greater than mine. Some had left their countries with only one suitcase. Others were rebuilding their lives after losing everything. One older gentleman smiled while telling me, "Every beginning feels heavy until it becomes your normal life." His words stayed with me because they sounded remarkably true. while helping visitors complete simple forms, answer questions, and practice everyday conversations. I realized that teaching others strengthened my own English even more. Educational research shows that explaining information to someone else improves understanding and long-term memory because the brain organizes knowledge more deeply while teaching. Without planning it, I had become both a learner and a teacher. Emily often volunteered with me after work. Watching her patiently encourage nervous English learners made me admire her even more. One evening, after everyone had gone home, we stayed behind stacking chairs and cleaning tables. I asked why she spent so much of her free time helping strangers. She smiled before answering. Because someone helped my grandparents when they first came here. Kindness has a way of traveling across generations. That sentence touched me deeply. It reminded me that every encouraging conversation I had experienced since arriving in America was part of a much larger story. Compassion rarely ends with the first person who receives it. It keeps moving forward. At home, however, challenges continued appearing in smaller, quieter ways. Cultural differences sometimes created misunderstandings neither of us expected. I was raised to keep personal worries private until I had a solution. Emily believed problems should be discussed immediately, even before answers existed. At first, those differences frustrated both of us. Then we discovered that neither approach was completely right nor completely wrong. We simply communicated differently because we had grown up in different cultures. Relationship researchers often describe active listening as one of the strongest predictors of long-term relationship satisfaction. Instead of preparing our next response while the other person spoke, we began focusing entirely on understanding first. We even created one simple rule. Before responding during difficult conversations, we repeated what the other person had just said to make sure we understood correctly. That tiny habit reduced misunderstandings almost overnight. At the same time, I continued building my credit responsibly despite my reduced income. Every payment was made before the due date. Every purchase was planned carefully. Gradually, I realized that financial discipline was not about earning the highest salary. It was about making thoughtful decisions regardless of income level. That lesson changed my relationship with money forever. Then one Friday afternoon, several months after my reduced work schedule began, I received another phone call from my manager. This time his voice sounded much brighter. Business had improved. The company wanted to restore my full-time hours and even offer additional responsibilities because they appreciated my positive attitude during the difficult months. I smiled so widely that people walking past probably wondered what had happened. When I shared the news with Emily that evening, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "See, we never stopped moving forward." Looking back now, I realized she was right. Progress had never disappeared. It had simply become harder to notice while we were living through uncertainty. Those challenging months strengthened our communication, our financial habits, and our trust in each other far more than easy times ever could. Neither of us realized that the next dream waiting ahead was much bigger than better jobs or improving credit scores. We were about to begin searching for a place that could truly become our first home together. And that journey would introduce a completely new set of lessons about commitment, responsibility, and building a future as a family. As winter slowly gave way to spring, our conversations changed. We still talked about English, books, movies, and funny cultural misunderstandings, but a new topic appeared almost every evening. It began with simple questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Would you rather live in the city or somewhere quieter? What kind of home feels like home to you? At first, they sounded like ordinary conversations. Looking back, they were quietly preparing us for the next chapter of our lives. One Sunday afternoon, while walking through a peaceful neighborhood, filled with children riding bicycles and families planting flowers in their front yards. Emily suddenly slowed her pace. She looked around, smiled, and said, "One day, I'd love to live somewhere like this." I looked at the houses, each one different, yet all carrying the same feeling of comfort. For a moment, I imagined returning home after work, hearing laughter inside, cooking dinner together, and speaking English so naturally that I no longer thought about every sentence before saying it. The picture felt incredibly real. Then reality gently interrupted my imagination. Buying a home in America was not simply about finding a beautiful house. It involved savings, income, interest rates, and one very familiar topic, credit scores. A year earlier, hearing those words would have filled me with anxiety. Now they motivated me. Every responsible financial decision suddenly had a clear purpose. Every payment made on time was no longer just another task. It was another small step toward building the future we were beginning to imagine together. Emily noticed my thoughtful expression and smiled. "We're not buying a house tomorrow," she said, "but we can start preparing today." That sentence perfectly summarized everything we had learned over the past 2 years. Great achievements rarely happen all at once. They begin long before anyone else notices. Researchers who study long-term success often describe something called delayed gratification, the ability to sacrifice small immediate rewards for larger future goals. Study after study has shown that people who practice this skill often experience better financial stability, healthier relationships, and greater life satisfaction. Without realizing it, Emily and I had already been practicing delayed gratification through our daily habits. We cooked at home instead of eating out every night. We saved consistently, even when the amount seemed small. We invested time in conversations instead of endless distractions. Those habits were quietly shaping our future. Around the same time, something else changed. My coworkers began asking me for help. At first, it was only with small tasks. One asked me to explain a software update to a new employee. Another asked if I could help translate simple English instructions for someone whose first language was not English. The request surprised me because I still thought of myself as someone learning the language. Apparently, everyone else had already started seeing me differently. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the competence gap. We often underestimate our own progress because we compare ourselves to perfection instead of comparing ourselves to where we started. When I remembered the nervous person who had once been afraid to order coffee, I realized just how far I had come. My English was no longer perfect, but it had become practical, confident, and genuinely useful. That realization gave me even greater motivation to continue improving. One evening, while reviewing our monthly finances, Emily looked at the latest credit report and smiled proudly. My score had improved again. The increase was not dramatic, but it represented months of consistency. We celebrated with homemade pizza and a long walk through the park instead of spending money on an expensive dinner. Strangely enough, that simple celebration felt more meaningful than anything we could have bought. It reminded us that happiness often grows from shared experiences rather than expensive purchases. As the sun disappeared behind the trees that evening, neither of us knew that the dreams we had quietly nurtured were about to become much more real than we had ever imagined. The next opportunity would challenge us to take a leap neither of us felt completely ready for, but sometimes life rewards those who prepare patiently, long before opportunity finally knocks. Building our home. I'm about to tell you about the moment when a dream that had lived quietly inside our conversations finally stepped into the real world. For months, Emily and I had talked about building a future together. We had imagined a warm kitchen filled with laughter, a small living room where we could read books on rainy afternoons, and a place that truly felt like home. But dreaming is easy. Turning dreams into reality is where life begins asking difficult questions. Were we financially ready? Was my credit score finally strong enough? Could two ordinary people, armed with patience, small habits, and a lot of hope, really build a life together in America? What happened next taught me that a home is never built with walls alone. It is built with trust, consistency, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the future still feels uncertain. The idea of finding our first home together no longer felt like a distant fantasy. It became something we discussed almost every evening after dinner. Sometimes we sat at the kitchen table with notebooks and calculators. Other times we walked through neighborhoods simply to imagine what life might look like there. We weren't searching for luxury. We weren't chasing the biggest house or the newest neighborhood. We wanted something much simpler. We wanted a place where peace would be louder than stress, where conversations would matter more than furniture, and where every room would remind us how far we had come. Looking back now, I realize we were searching for much more than a house. We were searching for a feeling. Before speaking with a real estate agent, we decided to understand exactly where we stood financially. Emily suggested that we treat the process like another learning project instead of something frightening. We gathered our savings records, reviewed our monthly budget, checked my updated credit score, and carefully examined our spending habits. The numbers no longer scared me the way they once had. They simply told a story. Every on-time payment, every month of disciplined budgeting, every careful financial decision had quietly strengthened our position. Financial educators often explain that your credit score is not a judgment of your worth. It is a summary of your financial behavior over time. That distinction had completely changed my mindset. Years earlier, I thought the score defined me. Now I understood that my daily choices were the real story. One Saturday morning we met with a mortgage advisor. Walking into the office reminded me of my first visit to the bank months before. Back then I had felt nervous, confused, and completely unfamiliar with the American financial system. This time felt different. I still had questions, but I no longer felt powerless. The advisor reviewed our information carefully before smiling. "You've made excellent progress," she said. Hearing those words filled me with quiet pride. She explained how responsible credit use, steady income, and healthy financial habits had opened opportunities that simply didn't exist when I first arrived in the United States. For a moment, I thought back to the day I had no credit history at all. The journey suddenly felt much bigger than numbers on a report. It represented persistence. It represented growth. It represented believing in slow progress even when results seemed invisible. As we left the office, Emily squeezed my hand. "See," she whispered. "Every small step mattered." She was right. Behavioral psychologists often describe something called the compound effect. Tiny actions repeated consistently create surprisingly large results over long periods of time. Most people underestimate what they can accomplish in several years because daily progress feels almost invisible. Looking at our situation, I understood exactly what they meant. One English lesson never changed my life. One on-time payment never changed my future. One honest conversation never built a relationship. But together, those thousands of ordinary moments had quietly transformed everything. Over the following weeks, we visited several homes. Some looked beautiful in photographs, but felt uncomfortable the moment we stepped inside. Others were too expensive, too far from work, or simply didn't feel right. At first I worried we would never find the right place. Emily remained remarkably calm. "The right home isn't only something you see," she said. "Sometimes it's something you feel." One afternoon, our real estate agent unlocked the door to a modest two-bedroom townhouse on a quiet street lined with young maple trees. Sunlight poured through the living room windows. The kitchen wasn't large, but it felt warm and inviting. A small backyard overlooked a peaceful walking trail where families pushed strollers and children played with their dogs. We stood silently for several seconds. Neither of us spoke because we were both imagining exactly the same future. I could almost hear conversations that hadn't happened yet. Weekend breakfasts, holiday dinners, friends gathered around the table. Maybe one day, children laughing in the next room. The house wasn't perfect. The paint needed refreshing. The carpet showed signs of age. The garden had clearly been neglected, yet somehow it already felt like home. Scientists studying environmental psychology have found that people often form emotional connections with places almost immediately. Our brains naturally associate physical spaces with safety, belonging, and future memories. Standing inside that townhouse, I understood the research without needing to read another study. We weren't falling in love with the building. We were falling in love with the life we could build inside it. Of course, reality still required practical decisions. We reviewed inspection reports carefully. We discussed insurance, maintenance costs, taxes, and monthly payments. Every decision required patience. Every document introduced new English vocabulary. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, I treated each unfamiliar word as another opportunity to grow. Escrow, equity, closing costs, interest rate. Months earlier, these terms would have intimidated me. Now, they simply became new pages in my notebook. Learning had become part of everyday life. One evening, after reviewing every detail for the final time, Emily looked across the table and smiled. "Are you ready?" she asked. I looked around our small apartment where so many important chapters of our lives had begun. This place had witnessed my early English mistakes, our first long conversations, difficult financial decisions, countless shared meals, and dreams that once seemed impossible. It would always be special. But I also knew it was time to begin the next chapter. I smiled back. "Yes," I answered confidently. "I'm ready." What neither of us realized was that moving into our first home would soon introduce an even greater adventure than building credit, learning English, or buying a house. Life was preparing to give us a new title that neither of us had ever held before, a title that would completely redefine our understanding of love, responsibility, patience, and happiness. The weeks leading up to our move felt like a strange mix of excitement and exhaustion. Every evening after work, we packed another box, labeled another shelf, or donated things we no longer needed. It amazed me how quickly a small apartment could collect so many memories. I found my very first English notebook tucked inside a drawer. The pages were filled with simple sentences written in careful handwriting. "My name is..." "Where is the bus stop?" "I would like a cup of coffee." I smiled as I flipped through the pages. At the time, those sentences had felt incredibly difficult. Now I could read them effortlessly. Emily noticed me smiling and asked what I was looking at. I handed her the notebook. She laughed softly when she saw my early attempts at spelling and pronunciation notes. Then she closed the notebook, looked at me, and said something I will never forget. "Never throw this away. One day you'll need it to remember how brave you were." Her words reminded me that progress often hides our starting point. Once we become stronger, it's easy to forget how much courage the first step required. Researchers who study resilience often explain that reflecting on past growth increases confidence during future challenges because it reminds the brain that difficult seasons have been overcome before. That old notebook became much more than paper. It became evidence that change was possible. Moving day finally arrived under a bright blue spring sky. Friends from work volunteered to help us load furniture into a moving truck. The entire day felt busy, chaotic, and joyful. Boxes filled every corner of the new townhouse. The kitchen table arrived before the chairs. The bed arrived before the lamps. Nothing seemed organized, yet everything somehow felt right. That evening, sitting on the living room floor surrounded by unopened boxes, we ate pizza directly from the cardboard box because we still couldn't find our plates. We laughed more that night than we had in weeks. Sometimes happiness doesn't require perfect circumstances. Sometimes it simply requires the right person sitting beside you. Before going to sleep, I walked quietly through every room. Empty walls echoed with possibility. Each room represented memories that had not yet happened. I imagined birthdays, family dinners, Christmas decorations, quiet Sunday mornings, and conversations that would continue shaping our lives for years to come. I paused at the window, overlooking the small backyard. Children were playing nearby while neighbors greeted one another during evening walks. For the first time since arriving in America, I no longer felt like a visitor. I felt like I truly belonged. That feeling had nothing to do with owning property. It came from realizing that home is created by relationships, habits, and shared dreams rather than bricks and wood. The following weekend, our neighbors welcomed us with homemade cookies and warm smiles. They introduced themselves, offered recommendations for local restaurants, and invited us to the neighborhood summer picnic. Once again, I noticed something beautiful about American communities. People often build friendships through small acts of kindness. A short conversation over a fence. A wave while collecting the mail. A simple, welcome to the neighborhood. Social scientists have long found that these small interactions increase feelings of belonging and improve overall well-being. Those tiny moments reminded me that community is built the same way as language, trust, and financial stability, one small interaction at a time. Over the next few months, our townhouse slowly transformed into a home. We painted the walls together, planted flowers in the front yard, assembled bookshelves that took much longer than expected, and celebrated every small improvement. Every project taught me new English vocabulary. Every challenge taught me more patience. Every completed task made the house feel a little more like ours. One evening, while sitting on our back porch watching the sunset, Emily quietly placed my hand on hers. She smiled with tears beginning to form in her eyes. Before she even spoke, I sensed that our lives were about to change once again. And this time, the news would be far bigger than a new house, a better credit score, or a successful career. It would become the beginning of the greatest adventure either of us had ever imagined. Becoming parents. Emily smiled gently as she placed my hand on hers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different from any silence we had shared before. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of excitement, hope, and just a little nervousness. Then she quietly said the words that completely changed my world. We're going to have a baby. For a second, I simply stared at her. My mind became completely still. Then almost all at once, hundreds of emotions rushed through me. Happiness.
Surprise.
Gratitude.
Fear. Excitement.
Responsibility. I laughed, then I cried, and then I laughed again because I didn't know what else to do. Emily laughed too, and before we realized it, we were both standing in the middle of our backyard hugging each other while the evening breeze gently moved through the trees. Looking back now, that was the moment I truly understood that life doesn't become easier when your dreams come true. It becomes more meaningful. During the following weeks, our home suddenly looked different. The extra bedroom was no longer just an empty room. It became the future nursery. Every conversation included new topics. Baby names, doctor appointments, health insurance, car seats, tiny clothes, sleep schedules. Suddenly, I found myself learning an entirely new set of English words. Ultrasound, stroller, pediatrician,
crib,
diapers, maternity leave. Once again, life became my English teacher. Researchers in language learning often explain that vocabulary connected to emotionally important experiences is remembered much more easily because our brains naturally attach stronger memories to meaningful events. That explained why I never forgot any of those new words. Every one of them represented someone we already loved before we had even met. Emily and I attended childbirth education classes together. At first, I worried I wouldn't understand everything because medical English contains many unfamiliar expressions. Surprisingly, I understood much more than I expected. Months of consistent listening practice had quietly strengthened my ability to follow longer conversations. I still asked questions whenever I became confused, but I was no longer afraid to do so. One nurse smiled warmly and reminded the entire class, "There are no silly questions when you're becoming parents." That sentence stayed with me because it sounded exactly like the advice I had received while learning English. Curiosity had once again become more valuable than pretending to know everything. As Emily's pregnancy progressed, our routines changed naturally. Evening walks became slower. Weekend shopping trips now included visits to baby stores instead of furniture stores. Every tiny pair of shoes we saw somehow made us smile. Financially, we became even more careful. We increased our emergency savings, reviewed our monthly budget again, and prepared for the additional expenses that come with raising a child. Interestingly, all the habits we had developed while building credit now made these new responsibilities feel manageable. We weren't starting from zero. We had already learned how to plan, save, communicate, and make thoughtful decisions together. Behavioral scientists often describe habits as invisible systems that support people during stressful periods.
We experienced exactly that.
When life became busier, we didn't need to invent better routines. We simply relied on the healthy habits we had already built. One Saturday morning, while painting the nursery a soft shade of light blue, I suddenly stopped and looked around the room. Just a few years earlier, I had arrived in America carrying little more than hope and uncertainty. I struggled to understand conversations. I had no credit history. I knew almost no one. Now I was standing inside our own home preparing a room for our first child. The contrast felt almost unbelievable. Emily noticed the expression on my face. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I smiled and answered honestly. "I'm thinking about the person I used to be." She walked over, took my hand, and quietly said, "He'd be proud of you." Her words touched me deeply because they reminded me that growth often happens so gradually we fail to appreciate it ourselves. Psychologists call this the arrival fallacy. People often believe happiness will finally arrive after achieving the next goal. In reality, lasting happiness usually comes from recognizing how far we've already traveled. That afternoon, instead of worrying about everything we still needed to do, we spent time celebrating how much we had already accomplished together. Then came the day we would never forget. Very early one morning, Emily gently woke me and smiled through a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "I think it's time," she whispered. Within minutes, we were driving to the hospital, while the sky slowly turned from darkness to dawn. Every traffic light seemed unusually long. Every minute felt important. Yet throughout the drive, we kept talking calmly. Years of communicating openly had prepared us for moments exactly like this. Several hours later, after what felt like both the longest and shortest day of my life, I heard the most beautiful sound I had ever experienced. Our baby's first cry. The room suddenly became filled with joyful tears, relieved laughter, and overwhelming gratitude. When the nurse carefully placed our child into my arms, the world around me seemed to disappear. The tiny fingers wrapped gently around one of mine. The little eyes slowly opened for just a moment. Nothing in my life had ever prepared me for that feeling. Research consistently shows that becoming a parent often changes people's priorities, increasing long-term thinking, empathy, and emotional resilience. I didn't need to read the studies to believe them. I could feel those changes happening inside me instantly. At that moment, my credit score no longer represented financial success alone. It represented security for my family. My English was no longer just another skill. It became the language through which I would read bedtime stories, attend school meetings, encourage dreams, and tell my child every single day, "I love you." As we brought our baby home a few days later, neighbors welcomed us with cards, flowers, and warm smiles. Standing at our front door, holding the smallest member of our family, I realized our journey was entering an entirely new chapter. We thought we had learned everything about building a life. In reality, we were only beginning to discover what building a family truly meant. A better credit, a better life. I'm about to tell you about the chapter that taught me one of the most surprising lessons of my entire journey. I used to believe that becoming a parent meant having all the answers. I imagined that once our baby arrived, I would suddenly know exactly what to do. Instead, I discovered something much more comforting. Good parents are not the ones who know everything. They are the ones who keep learning every single day. In many ways, raising our child felt surprisingly similar to learning English and building a credit score. Progress came slowly. Mistakes happened often. Some days felt exhausting. But every small step, repeated with love and patience, quietly created a beautiful life that none of us could fully appreciate until we looked back. The first few months after bringing our baby home completely changed our daily routine. Before becoming parents, Emily and I enjoyed quiet mornings with coffee and long conversations before work. Now our mornings began with tiny cries instead of alarm clocks. Some nights we slept for only a few hours at a time. Other nights felt even shorter. Friends who already had children smiled knowingly whenever we said we were tired. "Welcome to parenthood," they would laugh. At first, I worried that the lack of sleep would make everything more difficult. Surprisingly, it also taught me something important. Love has an incredible ability to give ordinary people extraordinary patience. Every time I held our baby during those quiet early mornings, I remembered how uncertain my future had once seemed when I first arrived in America. Back then, I worried about understanding English conversations. Now I found myself softly reading simple English storybooks aloud to someone who could not yet understand a single word. The beautiful part was that I was practicing too. Every bedtime story improved my pronunciation. Every lullaby made me speak more naturally. Language researchers often explain that reading aloud strengthens fluency because it combines listening, speaking, pronunciation, rhythm, and comprehension at the same time. Without planning it, bedtime became another English lesson. As our child grew, I noticed another quiet transformation. Money no longer felt like something we managed only for ourselves. Every financial decision now included another question. Will this help our family's future? That simple change influenced everything. We continued following the budgeting habits that had carried us through earlier challenges. We avoided unnecessary debt. We maintained our emergency savings. We paid every bill on time. We reviewed our expenses together at the end of each month. These routines no longer required discipline because they had become part of who we were. Behavioral psychologists often describe this stage as automaticity, the point where healthy habits require very little mental effort because they have become deeply established. Looking back, I realized our financial life had become calmer not because we earned unlimited money, but because we had developed reliable systems. One afternoon, while checking my online banking account, I noticed another update to my credit profile. My score had increased again. This time, instead of excitement, I felt something different. Gratitude. The number itself no longer fascinated me. What mattered was everything hidden behind it. It represented years of responsibility, patience, and consistency. It reminded me that every small choice really does matter. I showed Emily the updated score, and she smiled proudly before saying, "It's amazing how much can change when people refuse to give up." Her words reminded me that success rarely arrives with dramatic announcements. It usually arrives quietly after hundreds of ordinary days. Around the same time, I received an unexpected opportunity at work. My manager asked if I would be interested in helping train several new employees. The request surprised me because I still remembered being the nervous newcomer who struggled to understand workplace conversations. "Why me?" I asked honestly. My manager smiled. "Because people trust you. You explain things clearly, you're patient, and you never make others feel embarrassed for asking questions." Hearing those words meant more to me than any promotion. Educational experts often explain that the best teachers are not always the people who know the most. They are often the people who remember what it feels like to be beginners. I certainly remembered. During my first week as a trainer, I met employees from several different countries. Some spoke English confidently. Others were just beginning their journey. Whenever someone apologized for making mistakes, I always answered the same way. Mistakes mean you're learning. Every time I said those words, I realized I was also speaking to the younger version of myself. Meanwhile, life at home continued filling us with small moments that money could never buy. Our child smiled for the first time. Then came the first laugh. The first attempt to crawl. The first wobbly steps across the living room floor while Emily and I cheered louder than if we had just won a championship. Developmental psychologists explain that children learn through repeated encouragement rather than constant perfection. Parents naturally celebrate tiny improvements because they understand that every major milestone begins with many small attempts. Suddenly, I realized adults often forget to treat themselves with the same kindness. We expect immediate perfection from ourselves while celebrating gradual progress in children. That realization changed how I viewed my own journey. I stopped criticizing every mistake. I started celebrating every improvement instead. On weekends, our family developed a tradition of visiting a nearby park. While our child explored playgrounds, Emily and I often reflected on how different life felt compared to the day we first met at the library conversation group. We laughed about my early pronunciation mistakes, my confusion about credit scores, and the nervousness I once felt before every English conversation. Those memories no longer embarrassed me.
They inspired me.
They proved that ordinary people can build extraordinary lives through consistent effort. One cool autumn afternoon, while watching colorful leaves fall around the playground, Emily looked at me thoughtfully and asked, "Do you remember the first time you told me you didn't think you belonged here?" I nodded quietly. "How do you feel now?" she asked. I looked around at our child laughing with new friends, our neighbors waving as they walked past, and the peaceful community that had gradually become part of our lives. I smiled before answering. "Now it feels like home." Emily squeezed my hand gently. Neither of us realized that the greatest lesson of our journey was still waiting ahead. Soon we would discover that although credit scores, careers, houses, and financial success all matter in different ways, none of them truly define the value of a person's life. That realization would become the most important lesson I would ever learn. What really defines you? I'm about to share the lesson that took me the longest to understand. For years, I believed I was building a better life by improving my English, increasing my credit score, working harder, and creating financial stability. Those things certainly mattered. They opened doors that had once seemed permanently closed. But one quiet conversation with my child made me realize that the most valuable parts of life can never be measured by a number, a job title, or even a bank account. That realization changed the way I looked at success forever. It also answered the question that had followed me since the day I first arrived in America. Can a 3-digit number really define who you are? Our child was almost 6 years old when the question arrived. It came on an ordinary Sunday afternoon while we were organizing old family photographs in the living room. There were pictures from our first apartment, our first Christmas together, moving day at our townhouse, neighborhood picnics, birthday parties, and vacations to national parks across the United States. One photograph showed me standing outside the small bank where I had opened my first secured credit card. I smiled when I saw it because I remembered exactly how nervous I had been that day. My child picked up the photo and looked at it curiously. "Dad," came the innocent question, "why do you look so serious?" I laughed softly, because I was worried. Worried about what? I paused for a moment. I thought I wasn't doing well enough. The answer seemed confusing to a 6-year-old. "But you look happy now." "I am." What changed? Children have a remarkable way of asking questions that adults spend years trying to answer. I looked around our home before speaking. I stopped measuring my life with numbers. At first, my child didn't understand. So, I explained in the simplest English I could. When I first came to America, I thought my credit score would tell me whether I was successful. Then I thought my English level would tell me. Then I thought my salary would tell me. But none of those things could tell me whether I was kind, honest, patient, or a good father. My child nodded slowly. Then came another question. "So, what tells you that?" I smiled. "The people we help. The promises we keep. The way we treat others." That conversation stayed in my heart long after the photographs had been put away. Later that evening, Emily and I talked about it while washing dishes together. She smiled and said, "You know, your credit score helped us buy this house." It did. "Your English helped you build your career."
It did.
"But neither one made me fall in love with you." I looked at her and laughed. "What did?" "You kept showing up." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You kept learning. You kept trying. You stayed honest when life became difficult. You never pretended to be someone else." Her words reminded me of something psychologists often describe as authentic trust. Research consistently shows that lasting relationships are built less by perfection and more by reliability. People feel emotionally safe with those who remain consistent through both easy and difficult seasons. Looking back across the years, I realized our strongest memories had almost nothing to do with money. We remembered eating pizza on the floor of our empty house before our furniture arrived. We remembered laughing at my funny English mistakes while cooking dinner. We remembered late-night walks after difficult workdays. We remembered reading bedtime stories together. We remembered neighbors bringing homemade cookies after we moved in. We remembered helping newcomers practice English at the community center. None of those moments appeared on a credit report. Yet those were the memories that defined our family. Around that time, I was invited to speak at the same community conversation club where Emily and I had first met years earlier. Walking into that library felt almost unreal. The room looked exactly the same. There were new students from many different countries. Some looked excited. Others looked nervous, just as I once had. The volunteer introduced me by saying, "Today we'd like to welcome someone who began learning English here several years ago." Everyone applauded politely. I smiled and walked to the front of the room. Instead of giving a formal speech, I simply told my story. I talked about arriving in America. I talked about being confused by credit scores. I talked about making pronunciation mistakes. I talked about opening my first secured credit card. I talked about meeting Emily. I talked about building our family one small habit at a time. Then someone raised a hand. What was the most important thing you learned? The room became completely quiet. I thought carefully before answering. The most important thing I learned. I smiled. Is that progress is usually invisible while it's happening. Everyone listened closely. You won't notice your English improving every day. You won't notice your credit score growing every month. You won't notice trust growing after every honest conversation. But one day you'll look back and realize you've become someone your younger self could barely imagine. Several people quietly nodded. Some even smiled with relief. Perhaps they needed to hear those words as much as I once had. Before leaving, one young student approached me. He looked nervous. My English isn't very good, he said. I recognized the fear immediately because I had once carried exactly the same expression. I smiled warmly. Neither was mine. He laughed. I don't know if I'll ever sound fluent. I answered with complete honesty. Don't chase perfect English. He looked surprised. Chase real conversations. Speak. Listen. Make mistakes. Smile. Keep going. The language will slowly catch up with your courage. As I drove home that evening, I realized something beautiful. Years earlier, strangers had encouraged me when I needed hope. Now I had the opportunity to encourage someone else. Kindness had completed its circle. When I arrived home, our child ran toward the front door yelling, "Dad's home." Emily smiled from the kitchen. The house smelled like fresh bread. Soft music played quietly in the background. For one peaceful moment, I stood silently in the hallway. Not because I was thinking about my credit score. Not because I was thinking about my career. Not because I was thinking about English. I stood there because I realized I was already living the life I had once only dreamed about. And the final lesson of my journey was about to become beautifully clear. A happy ending. One warm summer evening, several years after I first stepped into the United States, carrying nothing but hope and uncertainty, our family gathered in the backyard for dinner. The maple tree we had planted shortly after moving into our home had grown much taller. Its branches stretched gently across the yard, creating cool shade where our child now played with neighborhood friends. Emily arranged homemade food on the picnic table, while soft music floated from a small speaker near the porch. Laughter filled the air. Looking around, I realized this scene looked remarkably ordinary. Yet for me, it was extraordinary because every small detail represented a dream that had once seemed impossible. Years earlier, I had worried about understanding simple English conversations. Now I was laughing naturally with neighbors from different backgrounds. We shared stories about work, school, vacations, and family traditions without me translating every sentence inside my head. Fluency had not arrived all at once. It had quietly appeared through thousands of ordinary conversations. Researchers who study language development often explain that true fluency grows from meaningful communication rather than memorization alone. Looking around the table that evening, I understood exactly what they meant. English was no longer something I studied. It had become the language of my everyday life. During dinner, one of our neighbors asked how long I had been living in America. Before answering, I smiled because I remembered how frightened I had once felt after discovering the importance of credit scores. Long enough to realize that America teaches patience, I replied. Everyone laughed softly, and then I continued. When I first arrived, I thought everything needed to happen quickly. Better English, better job, better finances, better future. But life had a different plan. It taught me that meaningful things grow slowly. The conversation turned toward personal goals. One neighbor wanted to start a business. Another hoped to return to college. Someone else was saving to buy their first home. Listening to everyone speak reminded me that almost every adult carries invisible dreams quietly inside them. We rarely know how hard someone has worked simply by looking at them. Social psychologists often describe this as the invisible effort principle. Most achievements are built through countless moments nobody else ever sees. People see the promotion but not the late nights of studying. They see the confident speaker but not the years of practicing. They see the happy family but not the difficult conversations that strengthen the relationship. My own journey had followed exactly that pattern. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Emily and I sat together on the back porch while our child slept peacefully upstairs. Fireflies floated through the warm summer air. Everything felt wonderfully quiet. Emily looked at me and smiled. "Do you remember the first question you asked me about credit scores?" she said. I laughed immediately. I asked whether not having one meant I had already failed. She nodded. "And now?" I thought carefully before answering. "Now I understand that numbers describe part of life, but they never describe the whole person." Financial responsibility still mattered. Paying bills on time still mattered. Saving for the future still mattered. But none of those things could measure kindness, honesty, resilience, generosity, or love. Those qualities were built through daily choices that no report could ever calculate. Developmental psychologists often explain that human well-being depends on much more than external success. Strong relationships, a sense of purpose, lifelong learning, gratitude, and belonging consistently predict long-term happiness more accurately than wealth alone. Looking back across my journey, every one of those elements had quietly grown alongside my English and my financial stability. A few weeks later, I received another update from my bank. My credit score had reached a level that years earlier would have seemed impossible. I smiled, thanked the progress it represented, and then closed the app without thinking much more about it. That reaction surprised even me. The number had not become less valuable. It had simply found its proper place. It was a useful tool, not my identity. The real treasures were sitting inside my home. One evening, while reading a bedtime story aloud, my child interrupted me halfway through the book. "Dad," came the familiar little voice, "I like listening to you read." I smiled warmly. "Really?" "Yes."
Why?
My child answered without hesitation. "Because your voice feels like home." For a moment, I couldn't continue reading. Those simple words carried more meaning than any compliment I had ever received. Years earlier, I had worried endlessly about my accent. Now the voice I once felt embarrassed about had become a source of comfort for the person I loved most. That moment reminded me that perfection is rarely what people remember. They remember warmth. They remember sincerity. They remember love. As I closed the book and turned off the bedroom light, I quietly thanked the younger version of myself who had refused to quit during difficult days. I thanked the nervous newcomer who kept attending English conversation groups even when every sentence felt uncomfortable. I thanked the person who kept paying bills responsibly before anyone noticed the results. I thanked the person who kept believing that small improvements mattered. Without those ordinary choices, none of this life would exist. So, if you are listening to this story today, while learning English, building a new life, improving your finances, or simply trying to become a little better than yesterday, I hope you remember one simple truth. Your journey does not need to be fast to be meaningful. Your progress does not need to impress everyone else to change your life.
Keep practicing.
Keep asking questions. Keep making mistakes. Keep showing kindness. Keep believing that today's small habit can become tomorrow's beautiful future. And whenever life makes you wonder whether a number, a score, or someone else's opinion defines your value, remember this. The most important things you will ever build, your character, your relationships, your family, your courage, and your hope, can never be measured by 3 digits. They are measured by the life you choose to create every single day. Lessons I hope my child never forgets. One quiet Saturday morning, sunlight filled our kitchen while the smell of pancakes drifted through the house. Emily stood by the stove humming softly, and our child sat across from me finishing homework for school. It looked like an ordinary weekend, the kind of peaceful morning we had dreamed about years earlier, while sitting on the floor of our first apartment. As I poured another cup of coffee, my child looked up and asked, "Dad, when did you know you belonged in America?" The question caught me by surprise. I smiled because I had asked myself that same question hundreds of times during my first few years here. Instead of answering immediately, I looked out the window toward the maple tree we had planted after moving into our townhouse. It had grown taller every year without making any noise. Nobody noticed it growing from one day to the next, yet over time it had become one of the strongest trees in the neighborhood. "I don't think there was one single day," I finally answered. "I think it happened little by little, just like that tree." My child looked outside and nodded thoughtfully. "So, you didn't become happy all at once?" I laughed gently.
No, y raplia.
Happiness usually grows quietly. Developmental psychologists often explain that children understand complex life lessons more easily through stories and images than through long lectures. That morning, I realized my child wasn't asking about immigration or finances. The real question was much deeper. How do people build a meaningful life? I decided to answer by sharing the lessons I wish someone had taught me years earlier. "The first thing I hope you always remember," I began, "is that learning never ends." I pointed toward the bookshelf in our living room. It contained English novels, children's books, financial planning guides, cookbooks, travel journals, and notebooks from different seasons of my life. When I first arrived here, every English sentence felt difficult. Every new financial word sounded confusing. But I kept learning one page at a time. Never stop being curious. My child smiled and asked, "Do you still study English?" "Every day," I answered honestly. Even native speakers keep learning new words. Language researchers consistently show that lifelong reading strengthens vocabulary, memory, and communication skills throughout adulthood. Learning is not something we finish. It becomes part of who we are. After breakfast, we drove together to the local library where Emily and I had first met many years before. The building looked almost exactly the same. New students sat around the conversation tables practicing slow English with volunteers. I quietly smiled as memories flooded back. "This is where everything changed," I told my child. "Not because I learned perfect English here, but because I learned not to fear making mistakes." We walked slowly past the same room where Emily and I had shared our very first conversation. I could almost hear nervous voices from years ago asking simple questions in careful English. One volunteer recognized me and invited us to greet the learners. Looking around the room, I saw the same expressions I once carried, hope mixed with uncertainty. One young woman hesitated before speaking. "My English is not very good." I smiled warmly. Mine wasn't either. Everyone laughed softly. "The goal isn't to speak perfect English," I continued. "The goal is to connect with people. Every conversation makes you stronger." My child watched quietly from the back of the room. On our drive home, another question appeared. "Dad, were you ever embarrassed?" I laughed immediately. "Almost every day." "Then why didn't you quit?" I thought carefully before answering. "Because I wanted a better future more than I wanted temporary comfort." Behavioral psychologists describe this as focusing on long-term identity instead of short-term emotion. People who continue despite discomfort often succeed because they care more about who they are becoming than how they feel in one difficult moment. Later that afternoon, we visited the neighborhood park where our child had taken those unforgettable first steps years earlier. Children laughed on the playground while parents talked nearby. My child pointed toward a young family speaking another language together. "Do you think they're new here?" "Maybe," I answered. "Should we say hello?" Without waiting for my response, my child walked over, smiled, and simply said, "Welcome." Watching that small act of kindness filled my heart with gratitude. Years earlier, strangers had welcomed me when I felt lost. Now my own child was continuing that tradition naturally. Kindness had quietly become part of our family's identity. Before sunset, we returned home and sat together on the back porch. Birds sang softly from the maple tree while a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh grass through the yard. My child leaned against my shoulder and asked one final question. "Dad, what's the most important lesson of all?" I looked toward Emily, who smiled from across the porch, then back at our child. "Remember this," I said slowly. "A credit score can help you buy a house. English can help you build a career. Money can make life more comfortable. But kindness earns trust. Honesty builds relationships. Patience creates growth. Love builds a family. Never confuse useful tools with the things that truly matter." My child nodded quietly. "I'll remember." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I realized every challenge I had faced, from struggling with English to understanding credit scores, had prepared me for moments exactly like this. The greatest reward of my journey was never the house, the career, or even financial stability. It was having the opportunity to pass hope, courage, and wisdom to the next generation. And although my story had begun with one mysterious 3-digit number, it was ending with something infinitely more valuable. A family that understood the true measure of a meaningful life. I'm about to share the final chapter of this journey. If you've listened from the very beginning, thank you for walking beside me through every challenge, every mistake, every small victory, and every lesson. This story started with confusion about a simple 3-digit number called a credit score. Along the way, it became a story about learning English, discovering a new culture, falling in love, building a family, and finding a place to call home. But every meaningful story deserves one final lesson. Mine arrived on an ordinary day when I realized that the life I had spent years trying to build was already quietly surrounding me. The journey was always the gift. One beautiful autumn afternoon, our family decided to drive into the countryside just outside the city. The trees were painted with brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. Leaves drifted slowly across the road as sunlight filtered through the branches. It reminded me of my very first autumn in America, when everything had felt unfamiliar. Back then, I admired the colorful leaves, but wondered if I would ever truly belong in this country. Years later, I was driving the same roads with Emily beside me and our child happily singing in the back seat. Life had answered my question without using words. We stopped at a small family-owned apple orchard where visitors could walk through long rows of trees and pick fresh apples together. Families laughed as children carried baskets that were almost too heavy for them. Couples took photographs beneath the trees, and older grandparents watched with quiet smiles that seemed to hold decades of memories. As we walked together, our child ran ahead excitedly, carefully choosing the biggest apples while asking endless questions. "Dad, why do some trees have more apples than others?" I smiled. "Because every tree grows at its own pace." That simple answer suddenly felt as though I was speaking to myself. Every person grows at a different pace. Some people learn English quickly. Others need more time. Some people build financial stability in their 20s. Others begin much later. Some people find love early. Others discover it when they least expect it. Comparing journeys only steals joy from your own. Positive psychology researchers often explain that people experience greater happiness when they compare themselves to their past selves instead of comparing themselves to everyone around them. Looking back over my own life, I realized that it had been true all along. The only meaningful comparison was between the frightened newcomer who once entered a bank without understanding the words credit history and the person I had become through years of patient growth. After filling our basket with apples, we sat together beneath one of the oldest trees in the orchard. Emily leaned against my shoulder. Our child happily ate a fresh apple while watching leaves dance through the air. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Silence no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Finally, Emily smiled. If you could go back and meet yourself on your first day in America, what would you say? I laughed softly because I had imagined that conversation many times. I wouldn't give myself financial advice first. She looked surprised. You wouldn't? I shook my head.
No.
What would you say? I looked toward the distant hills before answering. I would simply say, keep going. Keep learning. Keep asking questions. Keep smiling. Keep being kind. Don't be afraid of mistakes. And never believe that one difficult day predicts your future. Emily squeezed my hand. I think your younger self would need to hear that. So did I. On the drive home, our child fell asleep in the back seat. Emily quietly reached over and held my hand. Outside the window, the golden afternoon slowly faded into evening. The road ahead looked peaceful. For the first time in many years, I wasn't thinking about what came next. I wasn't worrying about tomorrow's responsibilities. I wasn't wondering whether I was good enough. I was simply grateful. Gratitude researchers have found that regularly recognizing the good things already present in life improves emotional well-being, strengthens relationships, and even reduces stress. Looking back, gratitude had quietly become one of the most valuable habits I had ever learned. That evening, after putting our child to bed, I walked into my small home office. On the bookshelf sat the notebook I had carried during my very first English lessons. The pages had become worn with time. Some corners were folded. Many words were crossed out and rewritten. I opened to the very first page. My name is. I smiled. Those 3 simple words reminded me where everything had begun. I carefully placed the notebook back on the shelf. Not because I still needed it to learn English, but because it reminded me never to forget where courage begins. It begins before confidence. It begins before success. It begins with one small decision to try. A few weeks later, I returned once again to the community conversation club where Emily and I had first met years before. This time I wasn't there as a nervous student. I was there as a volunteer. I greeted newcomers with the same smile that strangers had once offered me. Some spoke almost no English. Others apologized for every mistake. Each time, I answered with the same words. You're doing better than you think. Because I knew they probably couldn't see their own progress yet, just as I once couldn't see mine. Before leaving, one young student stopped me. He smiled nervously. I hope one day my English will be as good as yours. I smiled back. My English didn't change my life. He looked confused. It opened doors, I continued. But walking through those doors with kindness, patience, honesty, and hope, that's what changed my life. He nodded thoughtfully. As I walked outside into the cool evening air, I looked up at the sky and quietly smiled. The question that had once followed me everywhere had finally been answered. Can a 3-digit credit score define who you are?
No.
It can help you rent an apartment, It can help you buy a car. It can help you purchase a home. It can even create opportunities. But it cannot measure your courage. It cannot calculate your kindness. It cannot record your integrity. It cannot understand your love. It cannot predict your future. Only your daily choices can do that. If you're listening to this story while learning English, beginning a new chapter, moving to a new country, rebuilding your confidence, or simply hoping tomorrow will be a little brighter than today, I want you to remember something. You do not have to become perfect. You only have to keep moving forward. One conversation, one lesson, one responsible decision, one act of kindness, one day at a time. Because the life you dream about is rarely built in one extraordinary moment. It is built through thousands of ordinary moments that quietly become extraordinary when you refuse to give up. Thank you for spending this journey with me. I truly hope this story helped you practice your English while also reminding you that every meaningful life begins exactly the same way, with one small, courageous step. Before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with one final thought. If you came here today believing that your English wasn't good enough, that your accent was too strong, that you were too old to learn, or that your mistakes meant you would never become fluent, I hope this story has quietly changed your mind. Because fluency is not built in one perfect lesson. Confidence is not born in one perfect conversation. And a meaningful life is never defined by one difficult day or by one 3-digit credit score. Every sentence you practice today is building the English you'll speak tomorrow. Every mistake you make is proof that you're learning. Every minute you spend listening, reading, and speaking is an investment in a future version of yourself that will one day smile and wonder why you ever doubted your ability. So, here's my challenge for you. Tomorrow, don't try to become perfect. Just become one sentence better. Read one more page. Listen for one more minute. Learn one new word. Speak one more sentence out loud. Those tiny steps may seem invisible today, but they are quietly creating a future you can't fully imagine yet. And here's something I'd love you to think about before you leave. If your life were a story, what chapter are you writing right now? Is it the chapter where you almost gave up? Or is it the chapter where everything finally begins to change? The choice is yours. One small step at a time. If you enjoyed this slow English story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our newest slow English reading, listening, and speaking practice stories. Every week, we'll explore new real-life stories about American culture, love, family, everyday conversations, personal growth, and practical English that you can understand, enjoy, and use in real life. Leave a comment below and tell me, where are you learning English from, and what is your biggest dream? I read as many comments as I can, and your story may even inspire a future video. Thank you for spending your valuable time with me today. Keep practicing. Keep believing in yourself. Keep moving forward, one word, one conversation, and one day at a time, until our next slow English story. Take care, stay curious, and remember, that is all for today. I will make many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe to the channel so we can continue learning English together. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep practicing, and never stop believing in your own journey.